Good afternoon and welcome to May's Lunch and Learn lecture. Thank you all so much for joining us for what promises to be a very interesting presentation. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to join the stream and then we'll get things started. Welcome to everyone who's joined us for today's program. We're going to give our friends a few more minutes to join the stream and then we'll get things going. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline McCauley, and I work in the Programs and Outreach Department of Enoch Pratt Free Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn program, which Pratt hosts in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and Maryland 4 Centuries Project. Before we get things started, I'd like to remind you, should you have any questions or comments for our presenter today, please enter them in the comments or chat box below the video, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our partner at the Maryland State Archive. Take things away, Owen.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Owen Lurie. I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Maryland State Archives. Our presentation today comes from Dr. Ezra Greenspan and is entitled Writing the Biography of Frederick Douglass and the Bailey Douglass family, Scenes from the Archives. These Lunch and Learn lectures are an opportunity to hear the stories of Maryland's people and to highlight the use of primary source materials and the value of archives in uncovering shared heritage. Much of what you will hear today comes from the records here at the Maryland State Archives. The Archives holds records of permanent value of the state of Maryland and serves as the state's historical agency. If you are interested in exploring our records for your own research, I hope that you'll come and check us out. You can contact us and schedule a research appointment on our website, msa.maryland.gov. I hope that you will also join us next month on June 13th, when Dr. Eric Cheesem will give a presentation about Chessie, the Chesapeake Bay mythical sea monster. I'm particularly interested in hearing more about that. You can find a full list of our programs, including videos of past presentations on our website, and you can find more programs from the Pratt Library at prattlibrary.org. Now we're going to turn it over to Bert Kummerow, the founding director of the Maryland Four Centuries Project.
Thank you, Owen, and welcome everyone to our May Lunch and Learn lecture. All of us, including our partners, the Enoch Pratt Free Library and the Maryland State Archives, are committed to bringing you the best new research on Maryland's fascinating history. My own organization, the Maryland's Four Centuries Project, is busy preparing for our state's upcoming anniversaries. We have some very good news about our own project, the Maryland Mosaic. We introduced 120 Maryland people, places, events, documents, and buildings that were first in our history, but even more importantly, were first in the nation. And we learned in the process, Maryland is a small state with a big history. Taken together, these statewide firsts, or as we call them, mosaic pieces, give an important profile of our complicated history. Now, I introduced the Maryland Mosaic in our March Lunch and Learn webinar, and now the Maryland US 250th Commission has adopted it as one of its signature programs. We are proud that our mosaic will be an important part of the 2026 anniversary. You can stay in touch as we develop our website with all of the historical mosaic pieces that we're finding at www.marylandmosaic.org. Now, today's lecture is about a very familiar part of Maryland's story. I have always been so proud that Maryland's most famous citizens were all African Americans, from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman and Thurgood Marshall. And we can also include Benjamin Banneker for his amazing contributions. But Frederick Douglass is easily one of the most important Americans in the 19th century. Born enslaved, Douglass, as a young man with impressive talents, escaped to the North and used his abilities as a speaker and a writer to become a formidable African American presence in the growing abolitionist movement. One of my favorite aspects of his quest for attention was his interest in the new world of photography. Douglass became the most photographed 19th century American, and he used his images effectively to build his reputation. With a recent large and impressive Pulitzer Prize-winning biography and growing interest in his fascinating life, how can we learn more about Frederick Douglass? Despite the tens of thousands of studies of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, we never seem to have enough information about our most famous Americans. Frederick Douglass is placed firmly into that pantheon of American heroes. Our speaker today has taken on that challenge of searching for new aspects of Frederick Douglass's long life. Dr. Ezra Greenspan is the Edmund and Louise Kahn Chair in Humanities Emeritus at Southern Methodist University, and he has several biographies of Americans, including Walt Whitman, under his belt. Dr. Greenspan came to the Maryland State Archives' impressive collection, and knowing that Douglass was born a Bailey on Maryland's eastern shore, he began searching for documentary evidence of the remarkable Bailey family that created Frederick Douglass. That evidence has taken his quest back into the 17th century and to Maryland at the very beginning. I'm looking forward to sharing our speakers' adventures in the Maryland State Archive stacks, searching for the roots of one of America's most extraordinary citizens. Please welcome Dr. Ezra Greenspan.
Thank you, Bert. I think you've already given me a central line for my talk: a small state with a large history. In a way, this talk is all about that, about the centrality of Maryland history, but more specifically, the centrality of African-American history within that larger context, and at the center of that remarkable figure, as you mentioned, Frederick Douglass. Thanks to Owen Lowry for inviting me to give this talk, which I really have looked forward to. Another person who one might quote in this context is Douglass, and the epigraph to the talk returns Douglass to one of the central propositions of his life: the relation between the past, the present, and the future. For Douglass, that was an activist proposition. How do we acknowledge the past? How do we bring the past back in order to make the present and the future meaningful? Douglass was not unique in that respect. Mid-19th century African Americans were possessed of that particular concept at a time when it seemed the future might lead to emancipation. Douglass and his colleagues, people like William Wells Brown, James McCune Smith, Martin Delany, all look back on the American past, and they did with a notion that William Wells Brown stated very angrily, and I think very exactly, when he said, history has thrown the black man out. Brown was making the argument that versions of America, as they were being reproduced, written about, spoken about in the mid-19th century, were false. They were partial, they were inaccurate. And men like Douglass, Smith, Brown, Delany, as writers, as orators, and as activists, tried to go back and recreate that past in terms that were meaningful to their community. In a way, I want to do something similar to that by reviewing the history of one particular family. The family of their given name was the Baileys, later, and I'll be referring to them primarily today as the Bailey Douglasses, one of the most distinguished families of the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and not only because of Frederick Douglass, one of the most accomplished. We're going to do some time traveling. We're going to move fast through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. We're going to cover a lot of territory, but with a little bit of luck, we'll be landing back in the 21st century within the hour. The talk, which comes out of portions of my ongoing work on the biography that Bert mentioned, is episodic. I know no other way to cover 3 centuries, and because our visual medium of PowerPoint allows us to view, I'm calling those episodes scenes. And each of the 7 scenes that I'll be presenting over that 3-century period comes out of the archives. I work out of archives, the kind of work that historians like and biographers like me do is absolutely, totally dependent on archives. But there are different ways to skin an archive, and perhaps I'll be showing you a few of the ways that one might manipulate primary sources. The talk, as I mentioned, has 7 scenes, and I thought that it might be useful to put a table of contents together of the talk and invite you, if you wish, perhaps to take a photograph on a second device, or perhaps a screenshot that you might use as a point of reference as we move forward, or afterward if you want to try to go back to something that I've talked about and locate the images. This will be your way of doing that. Now, the story of the Baileys, of the Bailey Douglasses, is a very difficult story to reconstruct. Anyone who's tried to do African-American genealogy and history will know exactly what it is I'm talking about. The short of it is that there is no comparable situation here to the history of the family of Alex Haley. We cannot create a continuous line that spans the Atlantic Ocean, say from the Gambia, as in Haley's case, to Annapolis. All we can do is push back as far as our sources take us, and then engage in a process of deep research, but inevitably a matter of statistics and probabilities, of conjecture and speculation. It is a very, very difficult endeavor, but to a surprising extent, it often can be done. And perhaps you'll see a little bit of that in what follows. Now, as a biographer, one is always looking not just for one story, but for the original point, the earliest point in the story. Where do you begin? And that is one of the existential questions of this kind of recreation of African-American genealogy. What is the point of origin? And since we don't have it, and we probably will never have it unless DNA advances to the point where we can make breakthroughs that currently are not available, I'm going to offer two different stories about the origins of the Bailey family. Both are archivally based, and as I said, somewhat speculative and in some ways highly creative. And yet, I think they're real. Perhaps you will too, or perhaps you won't. So let's take a look first at origin story number one. And to document this, I went to the earliest court ledger out of Talbot County. Talbot County, the eastern shore of Maryland. Talbot County matters because it was the home, as far as we can trace it backward, of the Bailey family, probably for the entirety, certainly for most of the 18th century, and then well into the 19th century as well. In fact, there are many, many Baileys still living in Talbot County. We're looking at ledger cataloged as Book A number 1. One can't go back further than that to points of origin. And you're looking at what you'll probably notice immediately is a very poor quality photograph. And I thought for a long time whether I ought to present this or not. Those of you, though, who have worked in the reading room of the Maryland State Archives will probably recognize the problem. The lighting is so powerful overhead, it's very difficult not to photograph yourself trying to photograph an original. This is not what a biographer ought to be doing. But in fact, I think of it as perhaps a kind of iconic figure of what it is that we researchers do, peering into documents, reading as deeply as we can, reproducing them for our purposes. Although really what we're also doing would be to turn the camera 180 degrees around and photograph the institution that we're working in. They have their stories, they contain stories, they need to be read as well as the documents are. Now, in this particular case, we're interested in the next to last entry on page number 1. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story that happened this morning that changes the script a little bit. I originally thought that what I was looking at was the memorandum, the entry of the earliest slave transaction dating back to 1662. That's the year after Talbot County was established. And I thought so because in trying to read exceptionally difficult handwriting, somewhat smudged by time, I misread the word, what I thought was mulatto, for what was actually a very different word, just simply the word mentioned. This is not a slave transaction, and yet the transaction matters in a very significant way for our story. But what we're looking at is the sale of land, not slaves, by one Edward Lloyd of Talbot County, very nearly at the establishment of the county. This was Edward Lloyd I, the pioneer, the Puritan, as later generations of Edward Lloyds and of Lloyds in general would call their patriarch. He was the patriarch of the most powerful, the richest family, not just in Talbot County in the early decades of our history, but in all of Maryland. That's name number 1. And it matters for us because 5 generations down the line, the young Frederick Bailey, not yet Douglass, would live on the home grounds of Lloyd's greatest plantation, known as the Great House Farm or Y House, between 1824 and 1826, years that supplied the mature Douglass with much of the content of the opening chapters of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845. The names Lloyd and Douglass will be linked in many ways over a very long interlude. That's name number 1 from this entry. Name number 2, maybe even more significant. The witness to the transaction of Lloyd selling land to a neighbor was a man named Andrew Skinner. And we might say virtually the same things about Skinner that we say about Lloyd. They led parallel lives. Lloyd was born in Wales, came through Virginia, settled in the 1650s in the Severn River area near the future site of Annapolis, and then moved to Talbot County probably around 1660. Andrew Skinner, virtually the same, born in England, came through Virginia, very land rich like Lloyd, Severn River, and then to Talbot County by 1660, 1661. I've been reviewing the earliest ledgers and from the county, and perhaps the 2 most prominent names dealing in land were Lloyd and Skinner. Skinner was the witness to this particular transaction. Skinner matters because he too was a pioneer, a patriarch of another of the leading families of Talbot County. I think of them as the first families of the county, gentry, because generations later, by the 4th generation of Skinners, we see the first mention of the Baileys in recorded history. His family would master the family, the progenitors of Frederick Douglass, as far back as we can trace through the county records. There's one other fact about Andrew Skinner that matters to this story. In 1664, 2 years after this ledger entry, Skinner, who was a man of all trades, he was the high sheriff of the county, he was active in Puritan, Protestant, church establishment, again, like like Lloyd, and was an active surveyor, was called out to survey a tract of land of about 500 acres lying along Tuckahoe Creek in the northeastern corner of Talbot County. That tract of land already in 1664 was called Home Hill, Holme. It would be, 160 years later that Frederick Bailey Douglass would be born on Home Hill Farm, or in the context of my talk, not just Frederick, but many, many of his siblings, of his cousins, of his aunts and uncles, too, would be born on that farm. We're beginning to create a master narrative of the early history of the Bailey Douglass family. We now have 3 families interlinked over time. White and black, well, that is standard for recreating the past. The Lloyds, the Skinners, and the Baileys. There's one more family that needs to be introduced to this story. So to continue with this entry, pushing forward in time. In 1792, Edward Lloyd IV, Lloyds named their first son Edward generation after generation. Skinners named their first 2 sons, Andrew and Richard, generation after generation. Edward Lloyd IV dispatched his secretary to the Talbot County Courthouse to review land records. The secretary returned to Lloyd and reported that one particular tract called Home Hill had gone escheat. That is to say, there was no longer a record of legal ownership. A couple of years later, Lloyd purchased Home Hill. He died very soon after, passed it on to his son, Edward Lloyd V. And now we can introduce the 4th major family in the history of the family of Frederick Douglass, the Anthonys. Edward Lloyd V advertised in the local newspaper in 1795 for someone to captain his luxury schooner. The successful candidate was a young rising man from Caroline County named Aaron Anthony, the man we think most likely to be the biological father of Frederick Douglass. A couple of years later, Aaron Anthony, having proven his mettle to Lloyd, was promoted to the position of what they called the overlooker. That is to say, the chief overseer, the overseer of overseers of the dozen or so farms radiating out of the Great House Farm or Y House owned by the Lloyd family. At the same time that he became this chief overseer, Aaron Anthony married the 6th generation descendant of Andrew Skinner, a woman named Anne Catherine Skinner, and now Anne Catherine Anthony, and in doing so, became the master of the many Baileys who had passed down to the ownership of his wife through a succession of generations. In 1802, Aaron Anthony purchased from Edward Lloyd Home Hill, and therefore the succession of births of Baileys would follow. Baileys would remain on Home Hill Farm, often rented out to other parts of the county, but would remain as a core group of the family, well, really right until emancipation in 1864, with some departures, shall we say, some departures that went north, some departures that were sent south down the river. And so we have this coming together over a century and a half of 4 long-lived families that together would produce the general context of the life of one Frederick Bailey Douglass, and by the same token, of all of his relatives. It is a major story. Scene number 2. And origin story number 2, this one is shorter, simpler, and more direct. It's the more conventional way. And this I owe very much to the pioneering work of Dixon Preston, who was the one who went through Maryland State Archives and extracted the earliest references, mentions of members of the Bailey family. What we're looking at is the inventory of the estate of the recently deceased Richard Skinner, the 4th generation, descended from that original Andrew Skinner in the first scene. The date 1746. I'm not sure whether you can read, so I'll just paraphrase a couple of the entries. The first entry, which in a way is I think of as a kind of throwaway entry. It's a convention in 18th century inventories of listing the wearing apparel of the deceased, probably the clothing left over and not claimed by other members of the family. But directly thereafter, we have the mention of a Negro man named Bailey and valued, it is a high valuation, at 45 pounds. And then a succession of what best guess would be other members of his family, members who would eventually take the family name, the surname of Bailey. And the next 2, Preston presumed would be the most likely candidates for the partners, the conjugal partners, the wives of that Bailey, a woman named Sue, or it's written a Negro woman named Sue, and then below that, a one ditto, that is the typical abbreviation for a human being, named Sella, both valued at 40 pounds. Again, high valuations. We won't get into the complexities of this, but Preston guessed, and I think correctly, that in all likelihood, Sella was the partner of Bailey, and from Sella and Bailey descended the line of the Bailey Douglasses that we'll be tracing. It is not the only one, but is the one that has come into historic prominence. Now, Bailey, and I'm going to dwell in this talk on the male line, even though I think the female line is actually historically more important. But Bailey is easier to work with because his name appears in 2 subsequent Skinner family inventories. The third and last in 1781, when Bailey is still alive at the amazing old age of 80, or at least that was the estimate. His valuation had plummeted in the meantime. He was worth 0. Not an uncommon kind of valuation, whether you think of it as numerical or else. But if so, Bailey was a man who lived virtually the entirety of the 18th century. We don't know when he died, probably not long afterward. But this Bailey's origins are of immense concern. Where was he born? What was his line of descent? What was his language? What was his culture? We can only speculate, and I will speculate in my book, but the best guess would be that this man, Bailey, had probably been in Talbot County for a long time, and he probably had been a possession of the Skinner family for a long time. I do know that the first two generations of Skinners did not own slaves, but that takes us only to about 1700 to 1710, and that was the period when the enslaved population of Maryland exploded. So we really don't know exactly, and we would ask exactly the same questions of Sioux and Selah. The names that come afterward, members of their family line of descent, we start to see a pattern that emerges in the Bailey family of repetition of names. This was a family that named its children after their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation. It was a cohesive family. We know that too. They remained, for the most part, in the same location, on the same farm, always in the same little corner of northwestern Talbot County, Bayside, facing the Chesapeake Bay, where the great plantations of the Lloyds and the Skinners and the Hamiltons and such family were located over many, many decades. Now, I want to do one other thing with this particular inventory. I'm afraid it's not entirely legible, but the Skinners were a very affluent family. They had luxuries that most other families did not have. And I found very interesting the list of consumable luxuries that were left behind by Richard Skinner. They included such products kept in their outbuildings as tea and coffee and chocolate, sugar, molasses, indigo, but most voluminously, tobacco. Well, that's not surprising. Tobacco was the only homegrown product in that particular part of the inventory. Everything else was exported. In fact, was exported from the Far East, the human beings that produced it, from Africa, from South America, from the Carolina Low Country, South Carolina, from the Caribbean. In other words, even this outlying farm in a particular nook on the lightly populated eastern shore of Maryland was intricately connected to the global character of slavery in the 18th century. This little story is part of a much larger story, and one doesn't need a Frederick Douglass in order to make that kind of conclusion. That's origin story number 2. Now, let's jump to the other side of the American Revolution. The American Revolution, as we know, was fought over independence and liberty. The most injurious word that was used in discourse by patriots was the word slave, that the British overlords had enslaved their American colonists. And the revolution would bring to a kind of public spotlight as never before the issue of what constituted slavery, what constituted freedom, what constituted liberty. Scene 3 gets at this proposition with 2 particular documents, both taken from the court ledgers of Baltimore County, and I think of these as equal and opposite modes of behavior at a time when public debate over the rightness of slavery in a nation that thought itself endowed by its creator with particular rights, including liberty. The first document, standard document, one sees it all the time in Maryland and in all the colonies, rather the states now, was the sale of a slave by a man named Thomas Dorsey to a fellow resident of the county. And in this transaction, in return for 50 pounds in specie, Dorsey gave over not only a man named Anthony, but 3 other items. And they were a feather bed, Bacon's Laws of Maryland, and I'm using the terminology of the document, and a North American chart. Translation: featherbed, well, a luxury. The Laws of Maryland, well, one of the most important imprints off the Maryland press of the 18th century, the product of the most refined form of technology, of immediacy of the age. Printed by the leading printing family in the early history of Maryland, the Greens, and a book that contained the very laws that regulated the institution of slavery. The North American chart, well, charts were one of the most important products too of the press. In other words, a map of North America. One of the most important genres in printing in the 1780s, and this is a byproduct of the American Revolution, are maps. The reason? Well, maps of North America, in effect, rounded out the imaginary of newborn Americans. You know, think of them as Rip Van Winkles, awakening to a new nation and hungry to explore their personal identities, but also their territorial identities. In other words, this little mundane, commonplace transaction was one that brought to bear the authority and the power of the most important technology of printing, of immediacy, of visual imaginary renderings of surroundings, and of the laws and court system of Maryland, all, of course, indicted, written in the hand of the clerk of Baltimore County. That's one side of the ledger. The other side of the ledger, as many slave transaction sales were taking place, by the 1780s, one sees a surge, an upsurge in the manumission of slaves, something that will continue really until about 1800, more slowly thereafter. And this particular manumission, and interestingly, same family name in Baltimore County, Charles Dorsey, was manumitting a woman named Lucy and 5 other African Americans. It would be curious to look into this a little bit more. Were they a family? Did they have a kind of structure in history comparable in some way to the Baileys? Certainly, if one digs deep enough with these kinds of records, one will find parallel kinds of patterns. But in any case, one Dorsey selling slaves, another Dorsey manumitting them. These were the alternative pathways, perhaps, of American slavery following the American Revolution. And as we know, the northern states would very actively begin to move toward gradual emancipation or abolition of slavery. Maryland, that most middling of states, it is absolutely the crux of the eastern seaboard states, going in opposite directions, it seems, at the same time, although that will get resolved over the course of the 19th century as slavery continues. Scene 4. In a manner of speaking, is an outcome of scene 3. In 1832, a very nervous, anxious, nearly hysterical Maryland legislature began to clamp down with a series of laws that tightly regulated the movement of free African Americans. The term typically was the clinical term, the technical term of free Negroes. One way that they did that, this in the aftermath of the 1831 Nat Turner Rebellion, was to do a census, county by county, district by district, of the state's free African Americans. And here, in this particular district of Caroline County, that's just over the creek from Talbot County, and in fact, the farms on which members of the Murray family lived were just over the creek from Home Hill Farm. We see the first recording of the name of Douglass's future wife, Anna Murray. The categories here are very interesting. The first column reads, sorry, I can't read it myself. Left for, I guess it's left for Liberia. In any case, they were taking the names of people who they believed would be voluntarily emigrating from America back to their true homeland of Africa. And you can see in the next column how many takers there were. As you skim through these records, there were precious few. But more to the point for us, we see 5 members of Anna Murray's family, beginning with probably an uncle named Prince Murray, and then 4 other members. And here it's worth mentioning that Anna Murray's parents were both themselves born enslaved to very wealthy landowners in Caroline County along the Tuckahoe, and both were manumitted in the manner that Charles Dorsey had done, 30, 40 years earlier. It's also worth mentioning that as far as I know, no Skinner and no Anthony ever manumitted any of their slaves. They sold some of them down south, but they never manumitted. But here we have the beginnings of tracing the life of Anna Murray. Scene 5, perhaps certainly the most recognizable of all the artifacts that I'm showing. I believe that this was on display at the National Portrait Gallery until last month. What we're looking at is the account ledger. It's a standard account ledger of transactions kept by Aaron Anthony, a man extremely proud of his success in life, a man very, very good at double entry account keeping. But at some point near the end of this particular volume, this is at the Maryland State Archives, Anthony decided to do a totaling of his inventory of slaves. Virtually all of them were bailies. Virtually all of them were descendants of the granddaughter of that first bailey and that first selah, namely Betsy Bailey, in turn grandmother of Frederick Douglass. On the next page, one of the most famous pages, I think of this as certainly one of the most important artifacts in 19th century African American history, we have a listing of every enslaved person owned by Aaron Anthony over the period running basically from his marriage in 1797 to the end of his life and afterward. But in fact, there are a few names that precede even Aaron Anthony's ownership, in fact, even precede Aaron Anthony's birth. Clearly, in writing down this inventory, Aaron Anthony was consulting his wife, who would have had a memory of the past, and probably his brother-in-law, Richard Skinner. I can't remember if he was the fifth or the sixth, but in any case, we have circled on the left the definitive record of the birth of Frederick Augustus Washington, and we'll add the surname Bailey, and the accepted date today of his birth in February 1818. I think it's fair to say that generally when we read this particular ledger, what we're looking for is that particular entry. And with good reasons. Biographers of single-figure biographies are absolutely dependent on such facts. But in a different context, if we're talking about family as the central unit of whatever, of history, of biography, or of a particular kind of biography, all of these names are equal. They all matter, and they are kept in a remarkably meticulous fashion. Anthony knew dates, or at least we believe he knew dates. He gets the names down. When it's a matter of descent, daughter of a particular mother, we have it, and so it goes. Now, there is another name that I want to point out, and that is on the top right column. And this one, for some reason, is out of chronological order, is the birth of Stephen Bailey in 1819. Stephen Bailey was a first cousin of Frederick, although, as you can see by the very nature of the format of a business ledger listing human beings, the spine of the family, as it were, for accounting purposes had been broken. These people are listed not by nuclear unit or any such notion of organization. They're simply listed chronologically from earliest born to latest born. Stephen, if that were accurately kept, would be virtually right below the name of his dear cousin. They would come together in later life, and I think of Stephen as Frederick's closest biological cousin. Stephen would appear virtually right below Frederick, a year younger. Now, circled below that is the name, is the category of Caroline's children. And the first name, Caroline, who is listed almost right below Stephen, they were first cousins. Stephen and Caroline married in 1840, and a year later was born their first of about 13 children, a remarkable person named George Washington. Notice same middle name as Frederick Augustus Washington. Stephen Washington Bailey, George Washington Bailey, born in 1841. We're going to come back to Frederick, to Stephen, and to George in just a moment. So the inventory of the Baileys. Jumping forward quickly now, on April the 4th, 1865, the day after Richmond fell, as remarkable luck would have it, Douglass was in Boston, and Douglass joined the great festival, the Jubilee, of leaders of the Boston community at Faneuil Hall, the home of American liberty, going back to the American Revolution, place that Douglass had spoken at on behalf of the Garrisonians many, many times. And Douglass came forward onto the platform, and some of his remarks were printed in Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. I've highlighted one particular paragraph, and I need to read it. You need to hear it, because it has the basic qualities of Douglass's rhetoric. And you'll note the remarkable command of alliteration, repetition, parallelism. But what to me is most impressive is the play and the interplay of personal pronouns. Douglass always trying to figure his relation as a Black man to white people. And here's what he said. I have been making a new catechism, and it's a kind of call and response, and the editor is giving us the response. Hitherto, the race to which I belong has been sneered at as never having accomplished anything, never invented anything. But when an American asks me any questions concerning my race, what they ever did to prove their manhood, what they ever did to prove themselves entitled to liberty and protection in this republic, my answer will be that the first feet which timed their proud steps to the music of the Star-Spangled Banner in Charleston were the feet of Black men. That gets serious applause. And when it is further asked, what have you done? My answer will be that the first soldiers who entered the long beleaguered and long desired city of Richmond on the heels of the retreating rebels were Black soldiers. That what have you done, strikes me as very curious. Was Douglass, in parroting what a white audience was responding to his remarks, was Douglass saying that you is all African Americans, or is Douglass saying you as being represented by Douglass himself? Was Douglass the representative figure of his people? Well, Douglass was constantly regarded in that fashion by fellow abolitionists, by the general public, even by opponents of emancipation of Blacks. But this remarkable moment in which Douglass speaks on behalf of his people has another side to it that Douglass was himself unaware of. Because among the first Black soldiers entering Richmond on April the 3rd, I'm taking this from the National Archives, and these are the records of the Ambulance Corps, was the Ambulance Corps of the 25th Army Corps of the Army of the Potomac. That was an exclusively Black unit. And in that unit was Stephen Bailey, the same Stephen Bailey we saw in his birth and in his position as a father of George Washington Bailey. The entry goes, entered Richmond on the 3rd and camped on Navy Hill. Douglass had no idea that a member of his family, someone he had grown up with during his first 5 years, was one of those soldiers. But there's more to the story yet. Sorry, I don't have documentation. Because one entire regiment that went in, another Stevens regiment was the 19th USCT, U.S. Colored Troops, a Black Maryland regiment, a fraternal regiment, the 9th USCT, contained Stephen's son, George Washington Bailey. And I've asked myself many times, did father and son meet in Richmond as the capital of the Confederacy burned? the city was in anarchy. Did father and son come together at that historic moment, which would have been 16 months after each of them was sold over a period of 4 weeks by the last generation of Anthonys to own the last generation of Baileys, directly from Home Hill Farm into the Union Army? And I answer that question, well, what kind of a question is that? Father and son met in Richmond at this great moment. And I think that this is a way of broadening our understanding of the life and prominence of Frederick Douglass. Douglass speaks so extraordinarily, with such command of language and presence and audience, but boots on the ground. In addition to the boots of his sons, we have the boots of his Bailey cousins. And that leads to the final scene. And after hearing Frederick Douglass speak, this may seem mundane, but I think there's more to it than that. What we're looking at is the letter that George Washington Bailey wrote in 1886, 21 years after the fall of Richmond, to his lawyer in Washington, a man named George Lemon, who was perhaps the most prominent lawyer handling military pension affairs in Washington. And George Washington Bailey needed to establish the truth of his application, that he was who he said he was, that he did what he said he did. In a manner of speaking, his autobiographical narrative is a kind of distant parallel to the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. The terms, the language, the spelling may be much more mundane, but let's see if I can read it. Actually, Dear Sir, I was sick with the measles in July 1865, and I went to the hospital at Brazos, Santiago, Texas, and I was treated by some doctor, DR. I don't know what his name was, and when I got able to go on duty, the doctor had taken me for a nurse, and then I was made ward master in ward number 2 and in 66. And then he adds in very tiny letters, 18, in other words, using soldier language in the year 66. And then thinking better of it, I was taken with the cholera and I was treated by Dr. Arthur and Dr. Wiles, as near as I can remember the names. I did some very deep checking, and this is exactly what happened. And George's memory is absolutely on the mark. The doctors' names are right. The spelling is problematic. The grammar is problematic. But the point is that George, like probably every other person enslaved on Home Hill Farm, was illiterate before the Civil War. George's literacy, I believe, came during his couple of years serving in Virginia with the 9th USCT. They made a point of teaching literacy to their soldiers. And in order to be a nurse and definitely to be a ward master, he had to have been literate. He had to have been numerate. And what we're seeing is a demonstration of African-American literacy that both, to my mind, parallels that of Frederick Douglass, but also departs in one particular sense. If Douglass was an absolute mastery of rhetoric, if he represented a kind of summa of the uses to which language could be put by African-Americans, and in that sense was a representative of his people, we have a kind of complementary but also alternative version of literacy, that of George, hard-earned, never wholly complete, not a book-learned man, and yet a man who had mastered the basics sufficiently that he could write an important letter to an important person. In other words, what I think we're seeing is a different kind of representation of the history of the Bailey family. One doesn't have to be the uniquely gifted Frederick Douglass, a George Washington Bailey, man who in the second decade of the 20th century would be driving a Model T down Main Street. He was a successful man of Denton, Caroline County, Maryland, was also a fitting representative of his people. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greenspan, for such a lovely and detailed presentation. It's been fantastic to listen to and to see all of the great archival materials that you've provided in today's presentation. I want to give everyone just a few more minutes to put any questions or comments they might have in the chat. And while they're doing that, for anyone that might have joined late to the presentation, would you mind taking a moment to tell us a little bit about your upcoming book and the work that you've been doing around that?
Well, thank you for the promotion to upcoming. It isn't quite that far along. I would say it's probably 2/3 done, 400, 450 book pages in. But the work will continue, and it will run. Douglass becomes the central figure when I'm dealing with his lifespan, but it goes back really to 1634. That's when the story of Maryland begins, with the Ark and the Dove and the coming of the first settlers, including a mulatto. That time, at least I would have gotten it right. And it will run through the generation of Douglass's grandchildren. So it is the story, it is a saga of Americana, and what better figure to have at the center of a saga than the amazing Frederick Douglass.
Wonderful, and we'll look out for that. We have had many people just say thank you so much for your research and the content of this lecture. They're very appreciative. I also want to point out, someone was very excited about the materials that you had highlighted on Anne Murray, and they were curious where they could find other information around that.
Right, that's online.
I'm so sorry.
And I believe it's on the website of the Maryland State Archives. I should say the person whose work we're waiting for is Celeste Marie Bernier, who has compiled an enormous treasure trove of information about Anna Murray Douglass. That really, I have to defer, as it were, to the future. I think that her work will be coming out very soon. But the standard recent biography, it says biographers have taken the matriarchal line more seriously, thought more deeply about it. And to my mind, it is the critical link. I mean, that's the link that one can trace through the archives. You can't trace the patriarchal link. That's not the only reason why it's vital. But I think that's a rather vague answer, but it doesn't have a simple solution at this point.
Well, that also connects to another question that had been around your alluding to the female line of the Bailey family. And despite your talk really focusing on the male line, they had asked for you to briefly speak on that. But I mean, you kind of just covered that. But if you want to say anything more, please feel free.
I think we have to give them due credit. There would have been no male descendants without the female line. But to give you an example of how it might work, I have a chapter on Home Hill Farm in the 1840s. That's the decade after Douglass had escaped, but it's the decade of consolidation of the Baileys on that particular farm. And what one finds in the records of the Orphans' Court is the cost of keeping the good health and paying for expenses of birth, also of death, of Bailey slaves. And what occurred to me was that basically the patriarchal biblical line, which Jewish people are taught from day one, from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, really has in the enslaved world records, the correct way to put it would be the matriarchal line of Sarah down through Leah to Rachel. Those are the records. Those are the lines that the records show, and I do believe that as families were dispersed, it was the women who held the family together. Certainly, the infants that were nursing were sent out if they were hired out with the mothers, and certainly the bonds that would have been created would have been very powerful. It seems to be right there in the records. It's hard to be as exact going back to the 18th century because the records are less full.
Definitely. And our last question is, can you share some experiences on the Eastern Shore and working with family members?
The Eastern Shore is both the land and the people. That very elaborate story that I concocted of the family origin in scene one, in a way, to my mind, as I've come to know the Eastern Shore, is a kind of linguistic correlation to the geography and the topography. You know, those intersecting creeks, those complicated lines that somehow interweave patterns. That was the first powerful impression the Eastern Shore left on me. The next, I don't want to mention personal names, but meeting direct descendants of the Baileys, still living on the Eastern Shore, hearing their stories. Well, my book is all about one ongoing story. And although historians are often trained to disregard or to diminish the importance of subjective accounts by people recalling their family lines, it doesn't seem to be just, and it seems to be against the spirit of the kind of work that I'm doing. So meeting members of the family, one in particular has taken me to the sites, to graveyards, to churches, to abandoned schoolhouses that are parts of the Bailey legacy, some going back all the way to the 19th century. That's made a deep impression on me.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Greenspan, for such an informative and engaging presentation. Thank you to our partners at the Maryland State Archive and the Maryland 4th Century Project. Thank you also to the Hearing and Speech Agency for providing accessibility for today's program. And finally, thank you to our audience today for joining us for this afternoon's wonderful presentation. Stay safe, take care, and have a good rest of the day, everybody.